What will the new UK rules mean for Apple's App Store? This is Mac Voices. Today's Mac Voices is supported by MacVoices After Dark. Uncensored, off-topic, and always off the wall. MacVoices After Dark is available as a benefit to our Patreon subscribers. Sign up at patreon.com/MacVoices. Welcome to Mac Voices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, our panel continues our discussion of what happens in 2024 when the new UK rules regarding Apple's App Store and other app stores apply, what it means for how you buy apps, and what it means for your security. Let's go back and let the panel do the talking. I have to wonder what that's going to potentially do to the reliability of apps if you have things that are maybe, at least in theory, not as diligently controlled as Apple does. Now, if there was anybody that I was going to trust to, start installing things on my system, it would be Setapp, because I'm already doing it on my Mac. Yeah. So, that feels kind of good. Dave, how about, sorry, Jeff, go ahead, then Dave.
Chuck, I have a question for you. Do you feel comfortable installing apps outside of Apple's App Store on your Mac?
Assuming they're from a signed developer, yes.
Okay. So if we have something similar happening for iOS and iPadOS, and I'm not like putting you on the spot here, I'm just genuinely curious, what would be the difference for you? Why are you not comfortable with that idea on iOS where it's something you're comfortable with on macOS? I mean, is it simply because we've never had it before, or is there something else? I guess I am putting you on the spot.
No, you're not putting me on the spot, but I'm not quite sure. Can you restate it? Because I'm not sure I followed where you were going with that.
Okay, so it sounds like you're not really comfortable with the idea of having third-party app stores on iOS, but which is essentially like, hey, I'm just putting third-party apps on my device and I'm getting them from a different location, much like you do on the Mac. You can get third-party apps, install them, and you get them from different locations, not just the App Store. So what's the difference there for you?
I will qualify my answer by saying that we haven't seen this yet. So I don't know what the logistics would look like. If there's a pop-up that basically says that this app has been, and again, we're talking about Setapp here in specific, but let's broaden it out to say, that somebody else sets up a third-party app store. Then I feel like I'm potentially stepping outside Apple's walled garden, and I use that phrase in the most positive sense, that something could end up installed on my very secure iPhone, and it's as secure as it is, almost to the point sometimes of being a detriment because of Apple's diligence and the way they've set it up. And part of it, you kind of hit part of it, I must admit, because with Macs, we've all been installing things that were not on the App Store for a very long time, before there was an App Store. And we still have the ability to do that. But there is that extra little gatekeeper thing that says, this is something you've downloaded from the internet. You still want to install it. And if I remember correctly, there are things that this is an unidentified developer. Because I downloaded something not too long ago, and the installers basically gave me a message I had not seen in a long time, if ever, that said, this is an unsigned app, or again, I'm not sure what the phrase was, but basically, this developer was not vetted by Apple at all, and I did not install it. It's just like, this is just not worth the risk.
That app appears if an app isn't notarized.
Right.
Thank you. Okay, that's the word. That's the word.
Developer. And I'm sure there's probably not going to be any chance that unnotarized apps could ever be installed on iOS. So, first of all, I think, Jeff has an excellent point. What's the difference? If you're you're willing to download and install something from Panic or ProView or Adobe. Adobe's not in the Mac App Store. Then why wouldn't you be willing to install those apps, apps from those companies on iOS? Also, I would say that the security on iOS is primarily not because of vetting, in the App Store process. I think that is almost beyond cursory. They have so many apps, and there's coming through there that, it's not like somebody's, going through with a fine-tooth comb. They're not disassembling the code. There are, numerous cases of people sneaking things in. For example, making apps that work one way for a while, and then the developer can flip a server switch, and so they can sneak, have it work one way when it goes through app review and work a different way when it gets to you. And that's happened now. But, what's really protecting you on iOS is that the apps all run in a sandbox. And that's separate from the App Store. So, I would certainly assume that even if you were somehow allowed to install apps outside of the App Store, it would still run in the sandbox. So that means, for example, that App A is not allowed to access the files that belong to App B. That's baked into iOS. That's not something that happens from the App Store. We don't have that on macOS because it would make us all angry. Like, you'd have a JPEG and you'd say, okay, well, if you made this JPEG with Pixelmator, now you can't use it with Pages, say, or whatever. Everything's siloed. On iOS, everything is siloed by the sandbox, which certainly makes things secure. Sometimes it's inconvenient because we can't pass things around from app to app very, very conveniently. But that is not going to change, just because now Setapp is providing apps, or even if you're just downloading apps directly from, vendors.
I'm not enough of a programmer to know what's possible and what's not possible, Jim. But I still, and some of this is perception is reality. My perception is that apps coming from the App Store are pretty darn safe. And you're right. I know they can't go through every single one with a fine-tooth comb. But, is at least, because we've also had discussions about apps being rejected for crazy reasons, along with some legitimate reasons. So is there going to be any kind of vetting process for a third-party app store? And once again, a disclaimer that Setapp, I'm not concerned about Setapp at all, because they have done this, they've been doing it, they know their stuff, they provide a terrific value service and the value for the service. So that one, I'm almost looking at other third-party app stores that this would potentially enable. Dave, I think you were going to add something after Jeff, and then I just kind of riffed on it.
Yeah, I'll just touch about Setapp again. They've dabbled with iOS apps for the last few years. The apps now can be I don't know if they're necessarily sideloaded, but they're installed within conjunction of a Mac version of the app, so they're able to do this in the Setapp program and be able to send, if it's a cost program, they're able to actually sync them up, and you're paying as part of your Setapp subscription. But this is definitely interesting to see where it's going to go in the EU. The EU is just doing all kinds of things, with the Lightning to USB-C and all the other things that you have to deal with the EU. I commend Setapp for doing it and setting something up, because why not take advantage of the fact that it's a way to get those apps out there in its own store. You know, as the article says, Epic's going to is already jumping right on this in the EU, but you're missing the big audience of the United States here too. And no, I mean, I've always appreciate Apple's and charging what they charge, only because they're keeping us safe. They're keeping the environment safe in iOS, and I think it's something I would commend them to continue to do. But if Apple has to abide by the laws of the different countries of the world, then so be it.
So, are there any poison pills they could put in place in any way, shape, or form? Either requirements that would continue to, let's just say, encourage developers to list their apps only in the App Store?
Well, this isn't going to happen unless Apple makes it happen. Right. Setapp cannot do this on their own. They can only do this if Apple provides a mechanism for them to do it. It's not technically possible now. So, we can't really say what would be done until, we find out. And, I would assume Apple is going to scream, they're going to require court orders. They're not just going to be like, oh, somebody passed a law. Because this is going to be tremendously problematic for Apple to do this. How do they're going to have to come up with this whole alternate scheme and make it work different, and somehow it only works different in certain countries. How on earth is that going to work? So I don't, this is whenever this isn't going to happen for a long time. It would probably correspond with a major iOS version, because it's something that's like so baked into how iOS works that it might be as almost an entire year's like iOS 18 or whatever. Like all it would be is we're enabling app stores. There was a Brian had a question in our private chat about notarization and what that meant, and Jeff said it meant that developers have a paid developer programs have a certificate. That's actually what it was before notarization. So we've had to have signed apps for a long time, and that was if you were a paid app developer, then you got a certificate from Apple that you could use to sign your apps, and that's what we had until when did notarization start? 1014 or 1015? I can't remember. So notarization is now an additional thing. Every time you make an app, you have to send it to Apple. And they do have this automated tool that they run it through. And I guess they claim like that they're looking for known malware. So there's no human looking at it, but they just have an automated tool. I've never heard of anybody having an app rejected for saying it had malware in it. Who knows if that's ever happened. The process is fairly painless. It usually takes a couple minutes, although sometimes it can take longer, but most of the time it takes a couple minutes. So Apple does have to touch, so occasionally like Apple will have an outage and nobody can make a Mac app for, until Apple resolves that. And, I've seen that happen once. It's like one evening, can't do it. I have to come back and try tomorrow. But it's a lot, it is when it's working, it's fully automated, and, who knows what they're doing. But it's less so. Like they don't look at all at, like App Store Review can look in and say, oh, for example, App Store Review can say, we don't think your app is, useful enough, so we reject it. The kind of thing that biggest complaint I have, for example, I heard about somebody had an idea for an app for cleaning your iPad or your iPhone. And so it just basically put up a blank screen and made it like, so it wouldn't do anything. So you could like use a cleaning cloth and be guaranteed that it wouldn't accidentally press a button and make something bad happen, right? That sounds like a pretty clever idea, right? Well, Apple said, no, you can't even give that away. We deem that is not a useful enough thing. And so, we've decided that app cannot exist. And, my feeling is, why does Apple get to decide that? If somebody as long as somebody is, being truthful about saying, here's what my app is and what it does, and if it's got a price, what it is, then, why does Apple get to step in the middle and say, no, that app can't exist? So that's my biggest complaint about the Apple as gatekeepers.
Jim,
that they get to decide that.
Jim, it's interesting you bring that particular example up. I had not heard of that, but on a recent Mac Geek Gab, I know Dave and Pilot Pete, I think it was still when John was there, had talked about a Mac app that apparently did the same thing, that deactivated your keyboard and or your trackpad so that you could clean it and not be entering crazy entries. And it got stuck. And so they had to jump through some hoops to get it undone. One of their listeners had to jump through some hoops. And so, I'm not suggesting that would necessarily happen on the iPad, but I can kind of understand why they'd be hesitant to have something deactivate the ability to have input into the iPad, because, if something goes wrong, how do you get it back? And that's just an aside. But it's one more. Well, I don't know, but it's one more way.
An app can't prevent that. So it only prevented the app screen area, but it still, it didn't prevent you from switching to another app.
I don't know. I'm
Well, I know, because the reason why I heard about this story is because the developer, I was on a Zoom with some developers, and the developer told us about it. And, the interesting thing is, so he decided not to take no for an example and no for an answer. And then he went ahead and made an app that was like a game. And so it would show like a dirty window, and then you could wipe on it and it would clean as you did that. Okay. And that's all it would do. Okay. And then it did also have a mode where it was just blank. So it was the same thing. That went through. And so he was able, so it wasn't about protecting you from locking up your screen. It was just that Apple was like, nope, we don't want this.
Jeff, you had a comment you threw in our private chat that I think is very important.
Oh, yes. I don't remember if this was an earnings call or some other interview, but I do remember Tim Cook at one point saying that Apple would find a way to get its cut from app sales, regardless of where they're coming from. And he didn't elaborate on that. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what Apple does to make that happen and how they could possibly enforce that. Jim, you brought up that Apple will fight this all the way, and I believe you are correct. They don't have much time to fight, though, because this is supposed to go into effect in 2024 at some point. So that would mean that Apple would need to have some version of iOS in the EU that supports this feature or supports third-party app stores when the law goes into effect. And so how's it going to work?
Well, I guess, we have to wait and see what Apple's, answer is. Maybe they'll announce something and, here it is, or maybe they'll say, come and get us, or maybe they'll say, yeah, we're going to stop selling iOS devices in the EU. Probably that's not what what's going to happen, but we are seeing this kind of standoffs in other areas where, I think what Facebook is no longer doing news in Canada, and things like that are happening. So, but I just think, and I'm a Setapp user. I have considered that I might want to have a version of Panorama and Setapp. So I like Setapp, and I think it's a good company. But I just I'm not really interested in hearing what their story is now about an app store, because it's just premature. There is no story for Setapp until Apple says what their story is.
And that was one of the first points you made, and it's a good one. So, and Apple's not going to do this until they have to. But if they have to, if they exhaust all the legal options available to them, and they have to, I'm pretty sure they will, based on what they've done in the past with China and other places to adhere to local laws. But my question was, is there a way for them to encourage a developer to list their app only in the Apple App Store?
Well, and what form is it going to take? So Apple is undoubtedly going to come up with some interpretation that is most favorable to them, and some way to do it that they're going to say this meets the letter of your law, that Setapp or we other people may look at and go, well, that's ridiculous, that's totally bogus, you're violating the spirit of what the EU is after. But I'm sure they're going to legalese it, and may well come out with here we are, we're complying, and then then maybe the EU or whatever will come back and sue them, or it's going to go back and forth in courts. It's not going to be just something like Apple's going to be like, okay, here's it works the way everybody wants it. I just don't think that's going to happen. Apple, they will do something that they will claim is complying, that many people will be like, hey, that's not what we thought would happen.
Jim, I have an idea of what Apple could do, and it's horrible, but I could totally see Apple doing it. They could say, all right, well, you can have your other app stores, but you have to have a way to get your app store available on iOS. Therefore, you have to create an app for your app store that's available only through the Apple's own app store. And then once you install that app, it creates a sandbox where it's like containing all of the apps that you've gotten through this other app store, and they have to run in the sandbox inside that, which means every time you want to use one of those apps, you have to launch the third-party app store app and then look at a menu in there to find the app you want to run.
Yeah,
which would be horrible.
They could maybe do that, or they could come up, and say, okay, well, now any app sold outside our app store, has got to pay a SDK fee, and so you got to pay 40%, if you're outside the app store, or whatever. I mean, I guarantee you they've got lawyers, and they are going over this with a fine-tooth comb and say, what can we do that gets us what we want without
okay, Jim. So a couple reactions to that, and I guess I'm being argumentative for argumentative's sake, but why not? First of all, okay, you're right. Apple is going to interpret it as best they can, as if none of us would do the very same thing, right? We all look at things.
not saying whether they should or shouldn't do that. I'm just
but so they're going to do that. But how about the legislators who are passing these laws with not sufficient information? What Jeff just said, in fact, Barry put it in the chat room also, something similar. Wouldn't a third-party app store have to be an app in and of itself in the iOS App Store? And in that case, Apple could say, well, we want 30% of anything that's coming through that app to comply with our terms of service. So, yeah, there's so many different ways that you can slice this. So remember the tax situation with Ireland, and how the
I was
US
thinking of that.
was having a stroke about that, and it's like Apple, and you notice how that sort of died away because Apple was within the letter of the law. They were doing. You said the spirit of the law.
Well, didn't Apple get what they wanted because we changed our tax code, so they were able to repatriate that money without paying a huge tax on it?
Yeah.
So that's why that went away, because Apple, the government rolled over and gave Apple what they wanted, essentially.
Right. But I'm glad Webb's back, because Webb and I both have experience, and David too, with you better make the contract very, very clear, because if there are any gray areas, they can be disputed or interpreted differently. And so I don't know. I haven't seen the UK law, and I don't know what it looks like. And I'm certainly not a lawyer enough to know what the interpretations are. But man, Webb, would you agree that better be very, very specific as to exactly what they want, or Apple can shoot it full of holes?
Oh, of course. Contract law is a specialty, and international contract laws, and even subspecialty from that. And you're right; it has to be very specific, and it's the gray areas that people will always attack. So, it's
well, and the law is written by a legislature who are not technologists, and legislatures are famous for writing terrible technology laws that are, often unenforceable or almost unmeaningful. So
who was it? South Dakota that did that earlier this year? Do I have that right?
I don't know.
Who was it?
South Dakota did something, yeah.
They tried to ban TikTok and make it illegal.
That's it, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Good job, South
Chuck,
Dakota.
I just found an article from June of this year on what website am I on?
It was a Montana.
Mac Daily
Montana.
News.
Okay, sorry,
where
Montana.
Craig Federighi said they're working with the EU to be in compliance for the March 2024 deadline. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, I'm sure what it means is that Apple is working to comply technically with the letter of the law. And like Jim pointed out, screw the spirit of the law.
Yeah. I just took that article, Jeff, and threw it in the chat room for our friends there. And just to show you the kind of listeners we have and viewers and the people that show up here in the chat room, Barry asked, what about European astronauts at the moon base in the future? They're not on Earth, so what app store will they use?
That's actually a really good question, because by international treaty, the moon is not land that can be claimed by any one country. So it would have to be international. Although, if the U.S. sets up their own space or moon base, and then the EU sets up a separate moon base, when you're in the moon, each of these moon bases, now you would probably have to comply with the laws of that country.
Because what if I go on vacation in the EU, or somebody in the EU goes on vacation here? If they come on vacation here, do they have to delete all their apps from this alternate app store? This is just going to be a complete nightmare mess.
Yeah. Well, and would those bases be considered embassies? Because if you're granted an embassy in a foreign country, my understanding is that's sovereign territory of your nation.
It is. Yeah.
So there you go. Well, and just to show you that the listeners and viewers can't be outdone, one of our panelists just put in that the moon would depend on what Apple ID you're using. So,
yeah,
Eric.
Sorry, you're using an Apple ID that started from iTools. You can't use it above the troposphere.
Maybe they're going to have to start, embedding, selling different phones in the EU, and that the phone can tell whether it's an EU phone or and somewhere else phone.
And that won't cause any trouble for international travel at all. Wow.
Well, but that's the thing that this kind of law, really, is a nightmare, because you're going to have, when you get down to it, you're going to have to technically come up with some technical means that, you can use this app store or not. And so either you're going to have to go off an IP address, or you're going to have different phones, or, there's going to be some imperfect, method that, is going to have to determine that.
And you just said it, Jim, imperfect. Can you get a VPN to the moon? Never mind.
Maybe it'll be off of, you have to have I don't know. You won't have to have if you're buying out of a third store, so you can't be from your Apple account, because these customers won't be using an Apple account, theoretically, right? They'll be using some other kind of account. So.
Yeah, I'm going to give Brett the last word on this in the chat room, because we want to move on. But he says, I think Apple is perfectly content to let third-party app stores be a mess to give their app store the advantage.
Right.
That's a really interesting idea, Brett. That's a really interesting idea. This MacVoices Live session wraps up next time as we shift gears and talk about scanning your family's legacy photos based on an article by a friend of ours. And then we talk about whether Ford's vehicles are safe to drive based on a new security vulnerability that they are playing down. That's next time on MacVoices. We'll talk to you then. As always, I'm Chuck Joyner. Thanks for watching.
Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices, or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you MacVoices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.